Let's take a look at how scholars study history. Historiography is the term we use to describe the process of studying historical evidence. It includes analyzing historical writings, books, magazines, journal articles, speeches, lab notes. If we can get our hands on something that was written by a famous psychologist, it is of relevance to the field. There are two main sources of information: primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are called primary because they come from the person of interest. An autobiography, lab notes, someone's speech, their script for a speech. Those examples would be considered primary sources because they come from the person that we are interested in studying. Secondary sources come from an external source: a friend, a coworker, a stranger who decides to write a biography about someone. There are advantages and disadvantages to both of these sources. The idea is to get both primary sources and secondary sources. By combining them, we get a better understanding of that particular event. One of the major limitations of studying the history of psychology is that some of the information that we have is not complete and not accurate. There's a couple of different reasons for this. Some people, like John B. Watson, destroy their work before it can be published. Some information is not available yet. We haven't found all of the letters between Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. There is still information out there that we need to find in order to fill in some of the blanks that we have. And then some information is just plain deceitful. Carl Jung claims to have written an autobiography about himself. It turns out that book was actually written by one of his students. Because it's actually a secondary source, that changes how we look at that autobiography. In addition to not having all of the information or having the wrong information, the historian, the scholar, their interpretations are prone to bias and errors. Several historians may interpret the same event, the same contribution, in very different ways, as depicted in the image here on the slide. The most famous historian of psychology, Edwin Boring, he was heavily influenced by Edward Titchener, his mentor. Titchener he's an interesting character. We will get to him in a few weeks. Titchener tried really, really, really hard to create a subsystem of psychology. And although his subsystem eventually failed, it's no longer present really in the field of psychology today. Although his system failed, he still made great contributions to the field. So Titchener was very popular back then, not so much today. One of his students, Boring, became the person who wrote a great deal of material about the history of psychology. So much of what we knew about psychology came from Boring. Turns out that Boring left out some things. When you read some of his paragraphs, you get a sense that he was a big fan of Titchener and not a big fan of anyone else. That's a problem. If you're going to cover the history of psychology, you have to cover as many contributions as you can. You can't pick your boss and write an entire book about just your boss. Titchener was not the only psychologist. So that's an example of when a scholar's personal bias becomes a problem in their research. One of the other challenges to studying the history of psychology is that our understanding of the past is dynamic. It changes over time as we collect new information. Earlier, I mentioned the Freud-Jung letters. We know they're out there, We know they exist, but we don't have them. When we find them, we might learn something new about Freud or Jung that we didn't know before. Therefore, our book, that chapter on Freud and Jung, will need to change just a little bit. To combat these issues, today's scholars try to use what we call a new history approach. And this particular approach is focused on the context within which an event or a person contributes to psychology. We will talk a little bit more about historicism and external naturalistic histories in these last few slides.